Starting seeds for the spring garden can be a lot of work, but fortunately it's possible to significantly reduce some of the most time-consuming chores. Today I'll share 6 time-saving tips to help you do less up-potting, less hardening off, less transplanting, less fertilizing, and less watering. The first time-saving tip is to direct sow seeds outdoors instead of starting them indoors whenever possible. When you start plants indoors, you often have to up-pot them, and you have to harden them off and transplant them. Direct sowing eliminates these very time-consuming chores. There will be hundreds of edible annual plants in our garden when it's fully planted. I couldn't grow nearly that much food if I started most plants indoors. I don't have the time to plant, up-pot, harden off, and transplant that many plants. And frankly, I wouldn't enjoy it. But it's relatively easy to direct sow hundreds of seeds outside. Even before I started growing under cover, I started most crops outside. As a general rule, I reserve the grow room for tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, basil, celery, onions, and leeks, and I start everything else outside. So among other crops, we start peas, carrots, radishes, beets, turnips, lettuce, spinach, kale, cucumbers, beans, and squash directly in the soil. In addition to not having to pot up, harden off, or transplant these crops, we also don't have to water them as much. We usually get enough rain in late winter and early spring that crops that are in unprotected areas of the garden rarely need to be watered. And the hoop house, low tunnels, and cold frames hold in enough moisture that they only have to be watered once per week. And the covers will be removed in April, at which point the rain will do most of the watering for us. So direct sowing greatly reduces the time I spend potting up, hardening off, transplanting, and watering. Aphids and whiteflies sometimes cause problems in our grow room. I'm able to control them with soapy water, but it takes time and effort. However, outside, before or last frost, there are no aphids, whiteflies, or other insect pests. Slugs are also not active yet. This leads me to my second time-saving tip. To reduce pest pressures and the amount of time you spend fighting pests, direct sow cool weather crops outside before your last frost, instead of in the grow room or outside after the last frost. Direct sowing cool weather crops before the last frost not only avoids pest problems in the grow room, it allows plants to become established outside before insect pests and slugs are active. And when pests do show up later in the spring, the plants are adapted and mature enough to be more resistant to pest pressures than plants sown or transplanted after the last frost. As a result, I spend less time dealing with pests, and in my experience, natural predators take care of most of our pest problems for us. Another way to look at it is this. If I wait until after the last frost to plant cool weather crops, I'm also waiting for the pests that attack these crops to be more active, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Some of the crops that can be started before the last frost include carrots, peas, potatoes, radishes, beets, turnips, kale, collards, spinach, and lettuce. For more details on cool weather crops and their planting dates, please see the link to my spring planting schedule tool in the description below. Though I prefer to direct sow seeds outside whenever possible, we get better results when we start heat-loving summer crops like tomatoes and peppers indoors. Let's head into the grow room to cover the next few tips, which apply to starting seeds in the grow room. The third tip is to minimize potting up when growing in the grow room by starting plants in relatively large containers. Potting up is when you start a seed in a small container like one of these cells, and then later transplant the plant into a larger container like this pot. This may not seem like a lot of work, but it is when you're potting up hundreds of plants, which is something I definitely don't want to do. So to avoid this chore, I start most of our indoor plants in repurposed 24-ounce food containers instead of smaller containers. These pots are large enough that if the weather cooperates and I'm able to get my frost-sensitive tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants outside by mid-May, I hope to not have to up-pot them at all. Not having to pot up dozens or hundreds of plants is a big time saver. The fourth time-saving tip is to bottom water your plants in the grow room by placing your pots in trays and watering the trays instead of the pots. This results in water gradually wicking up into the potting soil and allows you to water less frequently. It also reduces fungus gnat issues. Fungus gnats are attracted to the moist soil surface, but bottom watering keeps the soil surface drier. I top water until seeds germinate, but bottom water after that. To bottom water, I simply wait for the tray and the soil surface to appear dry before adding about a quarter inch of water to the tray. This usually provides enough water for about a week. The fifth time-saving tip is to use a nutrient-rich potting mix so you don't have to fertilize your plants in the grow room. Because seeds don't need nutrients to sprout, it's often recommended to use a nutrient-free potting mix and then begin fertilizing the plants after true leaves appear. Though it's true that seeds don't need nutrients to sprout, there's no harm in using a growing medium that provides sufficient nutrients for plant growth after sprouting. This is, after all, how plants grow in nature. Simply by using a nutrient-rich potting mix, we're able to grow in our grow room without ever using fertilizers. Our potting mix of 5 parts cocoa coir, 4 parts perlite, and 3 parts vermicompost contains 25% vermicompost and provides more than enough nutrients to nourish plants while they're in the grow room. If you don't have vermicompost, many commercial organic potting mixes contain enough nutrients to sustain plants until it's time to transplant them. If in doubt, you could add commercial compost or worm castings to the mix. Compost from your outdoor bin may contain critters you don't want in the house, so you may want to avoid using it indoors. Sometimes gardeners will start all of their seeds at the same time and do all of their transplanting at the same time. This creates a lot of work all at once. It also runs contrary to the fact that different plants have different requirements as to when it's best to start seeds and when it's best to transplant. This leads to my 6th tip. Let your plants dictate when they're planted and transplanted. By following your plant's needs, your work will be spread out over time and will be more manageable than trying to do everything all at once. Following your plant's needs, you can start peppers indoors 7 weeks before your last frost, tomatoes indoors 6 weeks before, spinach and peas outside 5 weeks before, lettuce outside 4 weeks before, radishes outside 3 weeks before, and you can plant squash outside and transplant tomatoes and peppers after your last frost. By simply following these planting dates, which I pulled directly out of Mel Bartholomew's book, Square Foot Gardening, you'll make your work more manageable by spreading it out over a number of weeks. You'll also have earlier harvests, and you'll get the most out of crops like spinach and lettuce, which tend to bolt when planted after the last frost when temperatures are warmer. If you follow these tips, you'll significantly reduce the amount of time it takes to start plants for your spring garden. The work will be more manageable, and you'll spend a lot less time up-potting, hardening off, transplanting, watering, and fertilizing. As we close, here's one last look at the 6 time-saving tips. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe for more videos on how to grow a lot of food on a little land without spending much or working harder than you have to.